we do? We need President Biden. We need FEMA housing. People were getting sick.
Residents in East Palestine, Ohio, say they need help more than 2 weeks after a freight train derailed, spilling dangerous chemicals. Ahead, we'll also be talking about why authorities say the air and drinking water are now safe. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. A health clinic opened on Tuesday in East Palestine, Ohio, in response to complaints from residents who say they're suffering from breathing problems, headaches, and rashes. On February 3rd, a Norfolk Southern train carrying hazardous materials derailed, and a subsequent controlled burn sent a toxic plume into the air. CGTN's Jim Spellman traveled to Ohio. He joins us now. Jim, Michael Regan, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, returned to East Palestine on Tuesday along with the Ohio governor, Mike DeWine. What are they telling residents?
Two key messages they're trying to get across. One, that after extensive testing, the air here is safe to breathe, the water is safe to drink, that this is a safe community for people to return to. The second message is that the federal, state, and local government is in this for the long haul to ensure that this community is safe in the long term. But there's so much skepticism amongst people in this community. Especially skeptical are people who've been experiencing medical conditions after the crash while being told their community is safe. Take a look. The train tracks run right through the heart of East Palestine.
It's literally in your backyard.
Diana Smith lives along the rail line, less than a kilometer from the site of the Norfolk Southern derailment that sent toxic chemicals into the air, ground, and water. Trains pass through dozens of times a day. Does that make you nervous?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because especially after that happened, because I never know when they're going to come off the rails.
3 days after the initial crash, authorities released chemicals into the air to prevent a large explosion. Diana Smith says wind blew the chemicals into her home.
And about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got up to use my restroom, and I was like, whoa, what is that smell?
She says she's felt sick ever since.
I've been getting headaches, sore throats, my nose running, my eye crying constantly, like burning, itchy. Kind of ruined it for me.
She checked with her doctor but was told it wasn't clear what was causing her symptoms. Other residents have reported similar issues, and some have complained of a lack of medical care. On Tuesday, the Ohio Department of Health opened a makeshift health assessment clinic in an East Palestine church. Federal health authorities are also expected in town this week to assist. Authorities here say the air and water is safe, but many residents say they aren't so sure. This is one of the reasons residents of East Palestine are not confident that their environment is safe. This is Sulphur Run, the creek that runs right through the middle of town. Take a look at this. When you disturb rocks or scrape the bottom with a stick, this discoloration appears. They want to know what's causing that and is it safe. Over and over, residents say they haven't gotten the information they need to feel safe. But if environmental hazards are found here, it's not clear what options would be available for Diana Smith and many of her neighbors.
I really don't have nowhere else to go right now. You know, my landlord wants to remodel this place and kind of wanted us out of here before all this happened. And now it's like, where do you go? What do you do? You know, you're just got to stick around, I guess, and pray for the best. And one of the realities in this working class community is that many people aren't on social media. They don't have access to the internet. Diana Smith, that we met there in that case, that story, she only has a flip phone. So there's a sense that there needs to be more outreach, meeting people where they are to get them access to resources like the new health clinic that opened today. Anand?
Jim, Norfolk Southern, that's the rail company responsible for this crash. Is the company offering any help to residents?
So initially, the company offered everybody that was close to this crash $1,000, and we've spoken to many people who have taken that, no strings attached, without any problems. And the company says that they are committed to continue helping the community. The EPA not taking their word for it, the administrator announcing today here in East Palestine that they will require Norfolk Southern to pay every penny that will be spent for cleaning up this mess. There's so much anger here at Norfolk Southern. The company skipped a town hall meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I'll tell you, just about an hour ago, as we were sitting up for a live shot, a representative of the company actually approached me here to talk with me on background, a bit of a charm offensive, but what they're not doing is walking around the community and talking to those people. In fact, the CEO, Alan Shaw of the company, came here today just to tape an interview for a cable financial TV news network, and then he left town. There's so much frustration that the people here don't have a chance to speak face to face with the company they say is behind what they're going through. Anand?
Thanks, Jim. That's Jim Spellman reporting from East Palestine, Ohio. Well, let's turn now to our panel. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Bruce Fein. He's a constitutional lawyer. Also with us in Washington, D.C. is Joseph Williams. He's a former senior editor with U.S. News and World Report. From Phoenix, Mahmoud is the director of the Climate and Water Program at the Middle East Institute. And Benji Jones is a senior environmental reporter at Vox. He joins us from Iowa. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Welcome to the show. Benji Jones, great to have you with us. This train derailment and that spillage of the chemicals took place on February 3rd, and then we had hazardous materials crews that set fire to the chemicals. It was called a controlled burn. Now, among those chemicals was one known as vinyl chloride, which is very toxic. And when that was set on fire, it released huge plumes of smoke into the sky, huge clouds. So can you give us a sense of what the situation is right now, especially with reference to air quality, water quality, and things like that?
Yes, definitely, and thanks for having me. So we do know that there was this toxic plume of vinyl chloride and other chemicals that get produced when it burns, including phosgene and hydrogen chloride. And that was around February 6th when this burn happened. There were smells lingering well after that. We now know from the EPA and other health officials that the air seems to be clean, and same with the municipal water supply. I think there's a lot of concern among residents because there are still some lingering smells, and so if it doesn't smell good, there's obviously a reason to be concerned in some cases. So I think what the health officials are saying is that air and water is clean. People are still skeptical, and I think it will take several days longer to really figure out what exactly is going on. But the science that we have right now says that there are no harmful chemicals in the air, or at least not enough that would cause significant issues right now.
The other thing, Benji, as you point out, people are skeptical, but is it safe for them to move back into this area where the spillage took place?
Yeah, again, I think that health officials would say, yes, it is safe. I mean, they have run a lot of tests. They've tested over 500 homes, and they're not picking up any harmful substances that are linked to the train derailment. So there isn't any vinyl chloride, hydrogen chloride, as far as they can tell, in these air samples. And again, they've tested a lot of homes, and they've also been testing the water. So I think that according to the government, it is safe to move in. The tests that I've seen and the results of those tests suggest that it is safe. I think that if it still smells pretty bad, I would be a little bit concerned myself. But in general, I would say things are looking much, much better today than they were on February 3rd and 6th.
Mohammed, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, reports that there's also a chemical called butyl acrylate that was released into the Ohio River. It killed, according to some report, thousands of fish. The Pennsylvania State Senator, Doug Mastriano, he took a closer look at the water, and this is what he said after that. Let's listen.
We're on Leslie Run, just below the city. And looks fine if you glance at it, but watch what happens when they disturb the waterbed. Look at these chemicals, look at those colors. These chemicals, and it has kind of a butane smell to it. They're heavier than the water molecules, so they settle in the stream bed. And so it's going to take a lot of work to truly clear out and clean all these toxins and poison.
So, Mohammed, can this be effectively cleared out, cleaned, as the state senator says there? I mean, what's a longer-term impact on the river?
That's exactly the question. I think the reality is when you have this kind of contamination, specifically talking in the water side of things, if there is an immediate action for remediation, so in terms of cleaning up contaminated soils or isolating soils, isolating waterways to clean up these contaminants, in the short term, the longer that is delayed, then the strategy would actually shift towards diffusion, dispersal, dilution. And that is the hope that with time, enough of these materials are diluted, traveling, mixing with the water to continue to reduce sort of its harmful amounts. But I think the long-term issue, which a lot of these residents are probably sharing, is in the short term, we understand we're not detecting these levels at a amount that's concerning. But what is the long-term impact when we start to think of accumulation, residence time, retention? Are they actually dispersing in a way that is reducing their harmful amounts, or diffusing, or mixing, or diluting? And we don't know. This is something that is being watched and is ongoing. So we really don't know these answers, and we're just kind of keeping track. So that's the option available.
Joseph Williams, the CEO of Norfolk Southern, the company that owns that train, Alan Shaw, we heard our reporter talking about him as well. He posted an open letter to the residents in Palestine, Ohio, and that open letter said, and I'll read it to you, it said, "I hear you, and we are here and will stay here for as long as it takes to ensure your safety and to help East Palestine recover and thrive." So, Joseph, what kind of responsibility does the company have?
Well, I think the company has a lot of responsibility, but the courts will determine that ultimately at some point because, as your reporter mentioned, there's already been a couple of lawsuits. There are probably going to be more. The federal government is likely to come down on Norfolk Southern, from what I'm hearing from here in D.C., that they will bear some significant responsibility. It's going to cost them a lot of cash, I think, over the long haul. Some of them they'll be able to settle. They were handing out $150 or $1,000 to residents to try to make good. So yes, there definitely is a trauma offensive, but it's the overall, the long term, they're not going to be able to escape the fact that they're responsible for this collision. It was their train. They're responsible for running trains on skeleton crews and on just-in-time schedules. And a lot of these decisions that Norfolk Southern apparently made over the course of the long term, the 10, 15 years that we've had kind of a degradation in rail safety over the country, it's ultimately going to be time for them to pay the piper. So they're going to be doing damage control immediately, and they know that they're on the hook because their representative didn't stick around long enough to talk to Ohio residents face to face, which they would have heard a lot of anger. Mm-hmm. So I think they're going to have to pay a heavy price. How heavy remains to be seen, but I think ultimately they're going to bear a significant amount of responsibility if history is any teacher in this incident.
Right, Joseph, as you said, the federal government will come down heavy on the company, Norfolk Southern, but there have also been reports that part of the reason for this derailment was poor maintenance of infrastructure, of rail lines. I mean, is there something to that?
There absolutely is something to that. Over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, about 1/10 of the national rail force has been cut. We're talking maintenance workers, we're talking engineers. In 2019 alone, Norfolk Southern laid off 3,900 people. And those are jobs that have proven to be critical because they're trying to trim staff and trim personnel costs while raising profits. Now, part of this has been Wall Street is kind of egging them on, saying, yes, we're going to raise the stock of the value of your stock, and those returns go to the investors, but at what cost? So ultimately, they're going to have to come to a reckoning, and Norfolk Southern is likely not to be the only offender here. We're probably looking at a nationwide, a system-wide failure here, not only by Norfolk Southern, but probably by the federal government as well, in that they certainly have not done themselves any favors in safety and inspections because of a lot of cuts to government budgets. So they likely don't have as many rail inspectors or as many locomotive inspectors as they need to stay on the job and keep people safe.
Bruce Fein, as Judge Williams said a moment ago, there are several lawsuits in the works right now. In fact, there's one lawsuit which has been filed by two women in federal court, and part of that suit has to do with the company setting those chemicals on fire, creating what they say is a highly toxic cloud instead of disposing of those chemicals in a safe way. I mean, where do you see that going?
Well, in tort law, when you're dealing with extra hazardous, ultra hazardous chemicals, there's a doctrine called strict liability. Whether there was anything that was negligent in the way that they dispersed of the chemicals is irrelevant. I think all that would need to be shown by the women is that they have suffered as a consequence. There's a causal nexus between some injury they've suffered and the release of those fumes that were discussed earlier. I think it was really, continues to be, folly for Norfolk Southern not to send out high-level officials to meet with the citizens there. These cases, ultimately, they're going to be settled or they're going to be decided by juries who are human beings. And there's a huge amount of discretion in setting the level of damages, compensatory damages and punitive damages. It's less of a science and more than an art. And by displaying what I think is rather a callous attitude, by not having the decency to show up in person, whether or not these persons are in fact afflicted because of the injury or that they have, they're psychologically, they might call a psychosomatic problems because they're worried. These are not robust people anyway. They are going to end up, in my judgment, confronting very hostile juries, so that may force them to settle for much more money than otherwise. But I underscore, when you're dealing with ultra-hazardous products and activities as here, all you need to show is a causal nexus between what happened and your injury, and you're going to win in court.
And Bruce, I'm wondering, how complex would a case like this be? Because, you know, could we see something of a blame game going on here with Norfolk Southern saying, okay, look, we accept part of the blame for what happened, but as far as the infrastructure, that is the rail lines on which our trains were running, well, you're going to have to ask the federal government about that.
Well, there's something called, cross claims or indemnity. If Norfolk Southern believes that others have contributed, they could sue for what's called in the law, contribution. We weren't the only ones at fault. There are others that contributed, but that would be up to them. As a matter of law, there's this doctrine of joint and several liability. If you have more than one tortfeasor, they contribute to a single injury, the plaintiff can choose to collect all the damages from one or the other. Yeah. The two defendants then can sort it out among themselves, the proportion. But that's an issue that confronts Norfolk Southern, not really the plaintiffs here, who have arguably suffered the injuries from the derailment.
Benji, the environmental activist Erin Brockovich, she's planning a town hall in East Palestine on Friday. Of course, we all remember her for that case she brought against the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, alleging that the company contaminated drinking water in the town of Hinckley in California. That case was settled for $333 million. What does she bring to this case?
I think that she brings the perspective of someone who has fought a company and won, and has a lot of knowledge about the impact of toxic chemicals. And I think that she can really be a voice for the community. And I think right now, look, like this community is upset and angry, and they have every right to be. There should not be toxic chemical spills anywhere in this country. And so I totally can just imagine I can't imagine what it must feel like, but I can guess that it's pretty bad. So I think that having someone with that kind of name recognition and power and experience will be really good in terms of being a voice for this community and helping bring more attention to this important issue right now.
Mohammed, the Ohio governor as well as the EPA administrator, they insist that the water in East Palestine is safe to drink. In fact, they drank it themselves. But what about things like wells? I mean, could they be contaminated, and could they be contaminated for a long time?
That's right on point. The reality is the risk from this contaminated water supply is a little bit disproportionate in terms of the residents. Certainly, residents that are part of the community that receives their water from the city through their basically their local water utility, that water that's coming from that contaminated source undergoes rigorous water treatment. There's facilities in place in any modern city that treats water to drinking water standard. So I'd argue that probably those residents are at a lower state of risk because of that. But to your point, residents that do not take their water from the grid, so to speak, and are dependent on private wells, remote wells, they themselves have no regulated system of treatment. So they may have a basic filtration system at home after they pump out the groundwater, but they need to be on high alert in terms of avoiding any contamination because they are not don't have access to rigorous treatment that the city or water utility may have. And so I would definitely caution that there's a higher risk for those that are receiving their water from private domestic wells. Another concern to consider long-term, as this persists, is with potential of rains, precipitation, and overland flooding and flow, is that there's a potential of the spread of those contaminants further out and could also continue to contaminate some of these other groundwater wells.
Joseph, the U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, he is calling for the country's railroad companies to improve safety. The railroad industry itself has been pushing back very strongly against any kind of regulation of their industry, and government data shows us that, I mean, we're talking about a very high-profile case right now, but last year, 2022, there were 1,000 derailments in the United States. I mean, do you expect anything to change?
Well, it's hard to see how it will, and it's hard to see how it can't not, for lack of a better way to put it. I mean, look, the through line through all of this is capitalism, right? And I don't want to indict an entire system, but I do want to say that one of the things that we've got going on here is the rail industries have lots and lots of money. They spend that money very generously around Capitol Hill. The people who are living in East Palestine and other places like them, places in Alabama, places in Pennsylvania, the heartland of the country, they don't have a lot of political power because by and large there isn't a lot of money in their communities. Now, if this had happened in, say, Shaker Heights, Ohio, we probably would have a much more vigorous response from Norfolk Southern. We'd probably have more attention paid to it by the federal government. And we'd probably have a much stronger, a much more rigorous national conversation about rail safety. But the fact of the matter is that under previous administrations, most notably the Trump administration, safety protocols were pushed back, were rolled back by members of both parties because the rail industry was so intent on fighting them. And the reason why they're fighting them is because if they have to enforce them, it costs them time, they have to hire more people, and it costs them money. And that last one is probably the most important motivating factor. Like recently, they created something called PSR, that's Precision Rail Scheduling. And basically what that means is cutting the schedule to the bone, making the trails run regardless. Do you have time enough to inspect and make sure they're safe? No, you don't, because that train is leaving the yard no matter what. Profits boomed. Norfolk Southern made $3.9 billion last year. And that's no accident that it's coming shortly after they cut a lot of their workers who had their jobs were basically defined by making sure that these trains were safe to run. The federal government does not have enough people to push back. The fines are generally light compared to what the profits are. So it's infuriating to understand why it should change. It's also equally infuriating to understand why it probably won't, at least not in the immediate future.
Bruce, Joseph was talking there about where some of the blame may lay. He talked about the former Trump administration, which dropped proposals that would have required upgraded electronically controlled brakes on some of these trains carrying hazardous materials. We haven't seen that change with the Biden administration. Trades unions have raised concerns about safety, about car inspections being too rushed, about maintenance not being up to standard. Why is this industry not better regulated? Does ultimate blame lay in Congress and at the White House?
Well, that's one reason, but I want to underscore simply because the federal government doesn't have a regulation doesn't mean that Norfolk Southern can't be sued under state law for negligence, for recklessness, and pay staggering punitive damages. that will substitute for political donations, if you will. The jury has enormous discretion, and punitive damages would be determined in this case based in part on how much money Norfolk Southern was making over the years by shortchanging safety. So, but that means you have to have trial lawyers, and they have to be rather skilled, but many of them are, and sue because that's a way these liability suits that you enforce standards that could also be ordered by regulations of the Department of Transportation. Now, I think that despite the very large money that comes from the political action committees of the railroad industry, that when you have something as dramatic as East Palestine and the hazards being as pronounced as they are, and even though it's less than if it was in Manhattan or Shaker Heights or Cleveland, I do think that there will be pressure, certainly on the Biden administration, which has already taken, it's already taken a little bit of a hit because when there was a threatened railroad strike earlier, they decided that they would walk away from a request by the union members to have at least a way to schedule off of work to go see their doctor. So he may feel compelled here, as he's looking at 2024 already, that this is one of the things that he's got to do if he wants to keep, his labor vote in the rail industry. Anyway, there are just lots of considerations out there. I don't think Norfolk Southern is home free on the regulatory front.
Benji, I've only got about a minute left, but I want to address one other issue that we've been hearing about, and that is, do you believe, and you're a journalist, do you believe that this accident and what's happened afterwards has been getting sufficient attention in the national media? Because there's a lot of environmentalists, activists who've been complaining that it hasn't.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the beginning it wasn't. I mean, it's more than 2 weeks since the initial derailment, and it's really only become a big story now. I think that we are starting to see pickup, and people are putting attention on this. But it's also just interesting because you have a lot of distrust of the local government and federal officials in East Palestine, and it's kind of a story in itself. And so we're trying to understand what's real, what's not real, whether the science is right, whether it's not right, and that has become kind of a second story. So I would say now it's getting the attention, but it's a little bit frustrating that it can take so long just to, and such a big disaster to actually get attention on it. So I would say it is only now getting the attention that it deserves.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.